Illustration is everywhere around us, even in places we do not realize, or in work we do not recognize as an illustration. It is present in corporate imagery, products packaging, information and identification systems, news media, publishing, and so on. As a visual communication tool with such a wide reach, it should be hoped for that it appropriately reflects the diverse population it aims to address and represent. Unfortunately, this has not always been the case, and today, the creative industry still struggles with appropriate diverse representation. With a focus on editorial and brand illustrations, this video essay aims to discuss the issue of diverse and inclusive representation in illustrated work, especially in Western countries with multicultural populations. Global Diversity Practice discusses diversity in empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes them different in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, education, and national origin. For this essay, I shall be focusing largely on ethnicity. Robin Phillips Pendleton argues that to understand the impact illustrators have had on society's perception of non-whites is to study the history of race and the link between it and illustrated imagery over that period of time. Throughout history, there are various examples of illustrations that have shaped race and cultural perception, especially in times when photography was either unavailable or too inefficient to transport. For example, the constructed image of Native Americans in colonial North America. Phillips Pendleton notes that the pictorial press represented Indians as racial outsiders and cultural curiosities, usually in an us versus them manner, where Euro-American standards and values were the norm and Indian standards and values were abnormal and thus deviant. Similarly, the St. Louis University study on Euro-American depictions of Native Americans and their cultures highlighted the fact that these portrayals reflected the broader 19th century Euro-American viewpoint of the indigenous peoples of North America as other. The image of the American Indian was invented and visually created into a character white society wrapped their disdain and their fears around based on fiction. Illustrators at this time portrayed black people as caricatures with very dark, often jet black skin, large white-rimmed eyes, red or white clown lips, and wild, frizzy hair as a way to also other them, mostly consciously. This type of depiction has been referred to as coon and Sambo imagery.
So some of the characteristics of a coon/Sambo is both of them played a huge role in images and stereotypes that we see today. Both of them were used to show black people as lazy, stupid, unintelligent. They weren't capable of surviving by themselves without white people, without their masters. They were inferior. They were easily frightened or manipulated. They were weak. They were kind of seen as like an overall buffoon, right? Those are kind of the overall characteristics of both the coon and a Sambo.
Phillips Pendleton also notes how through advertising of products and food labels, illustrations push negative perceptions of minority groups, and in some cases, the accompanying texts were derogatory and written in dialects to imply that most blacks were uneducated. The imagery was pervasive and simultaneously influential in solidifying the perception of blacks as unintelligent and subservient.
Aunt Jemima is that kind of stereotype that is premised on this idea of black inferiority and otherness.
These demeaning images and depictions of Native Americans and black people have constructed racial divides across continents. The power of images and illustrations lie in how it can become subconsciously embedded in our minds and influence our perceptions and assumptions about others. In the 21st century, the impact of coon and gollywog imagery still reverberates globally in the creative industry, although by a lower degree. For example, Anton Kannemeier, a white South African artist, has used these styles to depict black people in the past few decades. And more recently, Mark Knight, an Australian illustrator, made a cartoon of Serena Williams in a heated moment during the 2018 US Open for an Australian newspaper, and he received a lot of backlash for discernible similarities to Jim Crow-era illustrations. Kannemeyer has argued that his use of caricatures of black people acknowledges the history of the imagery and serves as a satirical critique on racism, which then forces the viewer to talk about difficult subject matters. However, Knight has defended his depiction as caricature but without any racial intent nor influence from Coon imagery.
I have absolutely no knowledge of those cartoons or that period. I think what's happening here is people are just making stuff up. The cartoon was just about Serena on the day having a tantrum. I don't think I depicted her in Jim Crow style or racist overtones at all.
In light of this issue, the Washington Post featured a couple of illustrators who responded to the style of caricature Knight used. Darren Bell, an African-American illustrator, discussed his opinion on caricatures, specifically of black people. He explained that the features to exaggerate should be those that stand out, and not just when compared to white people. While Lalo Alcaraz, a Latino cartoonist, went ahead to caricature Serena himself, focusing on her actual standout features. He mentions that cartoonists need to be as thoughtful about the message of their cartoons, just as much as they are about the depiction, current and historical. He points out that they do not draw in a bubble. These two illustrators agree with the sentiment that artists cannot work in a vacuum, ignorant of the historical inferences of certain representations. Beyond the debate of careless caricaturing of minority ethnic groups and races, illustrators and their stakeholders have also encountered issues with the context of how these groups are presented in illustrations. For example, on February 14, 2021, Valentine's Day, this illustration commissioned by UN Women received a lot of backlash because critics pointed out that it reinforced the idea that black women are unworthy of love, citing the historic and current way the world views black women. The post was taken down shortly after, and the organization issued an apology and a replacement image. I spoke with Monica Ahanonu, a professional freelance illustrator, regarding this issue. She has created diverse and inclusive images in her work with companies including Vanity Fair, the New York Times, Netflix, and was recently commissioned by Google for the Doodle series to honor Audre Lorde for Black History Month in the United States.
It just felt like off.
Yeah.
It's like the illustration was really pretty, but it just didn't read. If like everyone was hugging themselves, or if there was another person hugging themselves and some people holding hands, that would help. But because everyone else was holding like in a couple paired, and like she was also to the side, like not even centered anywhere. Mm-hmm. That is like all these little subtle things. Mm-hmm. And I also I don't know if I just couldn't figure out like what they were trying to say. Yeah. Besides, been like maybe one of the other couples could have had someone who's like as dark as her, because I think that was another thing is like no one of the other couples were all like lighter skinned. Mm. And she was the only one that's like very clearly a black woman or just black. Exactly. Which is unfortunate because I'm always just like I'm always someone who's like give them the benefit of the doubt. But this one I remember seeing it being like, yeah, it feels off. Like it's like. Yeah.
From the current examples mentioned, it is evident that social media's reach has allowed for a near instant public judgment of illustrated work and its representations. This has caused illustrators to be more mindful of their depictions. However, some illustrators have now become reluctant to depict other or certain races.
I can see it in like some of my friends' work that they don't dive into certain races as much, and possibly not because they're not sure if they can represent it right or do it right. Or else, you never know how people are going to take it if they do it incorrectly. But I have a friend who I know has had like trouble, doing hair like for people of color, especially because like getting all the texture, it's like you have to put in a lot of detail to get it to read correctly. You can't just like do a shape and like it's like but what's in that shape? What is it? So
some have also tried alternate routes, like drawing purple skin characters to show diversity, which has not always been widely accepted. This is clearly an issue without a quick fix and requires constant re-examination. As mentioned earlier, the industry and its stakeholders have been making attempts to right old wrongs, as recent events like the Black Lives Matter protests have forced a change of racist imagery of brands like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's rice. It also spurred companies to hire black illustrators for work as a show of support to the cause. Sachini Imbuldenia, the founder of Studio Pi, a photography and illustration agency, suggested the following in an interview with It's Nice That. She talks about how creative and art directors commissioning work from underrepresented groups not only supports the individual illustrators, but it also makes the produced work much better. An illustration depicting the minority group of the illustrator would reduce the risk of ignorant and harmful representation. She also advises that these shows of support should not just be token gestures. For example, commissioning black artists just in response to certain times, like during the protests, or LGBTQ+ artists during Pride Month. Hitchcock makes a similar argument and wants that actions like these aren't just callous and at times offensive, they could have dangerous implications. Other ways to promote diversity include studying cultural history and challenging representational norms. Illustrators should understand the semiotics involved with representing different cultures and seek to challenge the norms to be more inclusive in their work. A simple example is shown in this illustration, which reverses common hierarchies to lift people up.
It's so subtle, but it is like powerful. Like I'm thinking about like a kid just, glancing through the, they see these randomly throughout their day or on a, little thing in the doctor's office. And like that little difference of seeing like a woman be the doctor, she's a Black woman, or even of any, race, it's just like, it is encouraging maybe. And also showing like, this is the real world. Like men and women are doctors, Black women are doctors, because it is like naturally like that, the left image is very, it's like what you would, I guess, like that's like the normal, what you see represented in these like, thumbnails or like, what do you call it? Stock art images.
Yes. Ad campaigns and editorial imagery, like some mentioned in this essay, beg the question if the minorities that were represented in the illustrations were also present in the decision rooms before they were approved. Along with commissioning illustrators from underrepresented backgrounds, the executives making these decisions should also include those minorities. In conclusion, it is beyond the power of illustrators to correct the damaging imagery of the past. However, the ability to influence current perceptions and popular culture by understanding their persuasive and influential role in history should be paid attention to, as they can serve as vehicles of change.